Good evening and welcome. Here we are at Town Meeting TV, and so named because it's town meeting season. And we are continuing our coverage of the forums and the debates and the issues and the candidates that you'll be voting on this March. This evening we'll be talking about the South Burlington school budget. And school budgets are on the minds of many Vermonters, and this year the news is interesting and a little different than last year. So I look forward to hearing from Violet, who is the Superintendent, Violet Nichols, of the school district in South Burlington, and she is joined by Tim Jarvis, who's the Senior Director of Finance and Operations, and Tim Warren, who's the Clerk of the school board. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having us, Lauren.
So we have some interesting news for the voters about the school budget. It's not an up situation this year, so perhaps they'll get some relief from that. And why don't we start, Violet, and tell us a little bit about the budget, unless Tim is starting with the vision.
I can start with the first slide, if happy to do that.
All right.
So are we sharing? Just make sure folks can see. So yeah, so this is our vision slide, and there are two important bullets on here. I'm not going to read them directly, but I'll just have a little statement here to kind of frame the discussion, because from the board's perspective, it's important that we have that vision in place, and that sort of encompasses a lot of what we're going to talk about coming up. So our budget for fiscal year 26 has been developed to ensure that we meet the needs of all of our students, uphold our educational priorities outlined in our ENDS policy as we have there, and comply with state and federal requirements. At the same time, we recognize our responsibility to the South Burlington taxpayers as well. Like our neighboring districts, we continue to face significant financial pressures due to rising staff, operational, and other costs, as well as changes to funding introduced in Act 127. The use of surplus funds for us in fiscal year 25 as revenue allowed us to fortunately preserve much of our staffing and programming for the current school year to the benefit of our students and our families. These funds also allowed us to achieve one of the lowest tax rate increases in our region, but we don't have the benefit of those surplus funds this year. So reductions are going to be required in staffing, programming, and other areas, unfortunately. So the board's goal for fiscal year 26 was to address cost containment, certainly, and to close equity gaps identified by the Agency of Education. We wanted to avoid draconian cuts, right, to our staff and programs that could significantly impact the learning and support our students and families receive and deserve. So the board's committed to making thoughtful, strategic reductions that maintain the quality of education, preserve essential student and staffing supports, and align with our long-term educational priorities. And we believe this budget achieves those goals.
Thank you, Tim. Violet, would you like to say just sort of what's the headline as a taxpayer in South Burlington? What am I expecting with this budget that you're proposing?
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. So as our board clerk just outlined, we really had to attend to a lot of details here with our goals of achieving our ends, which is the district's ultimate mission in support of all students. Equity is a big piece of this for us. We knew that it would be difficult for our taxpayers to sustain two significant increases back to back, with about 8.18% increase in homestead tax rate for fiscal year 25. Some of our neighbors, though, seeing double-digit tax rate increases for fiscal year 25. We were able to somewhat soften that impact with the 8.18% increase last year and the proposed 7.93% increase this year. So rather than a double-digit increase last year and then say a negative, as some are trying to attain this year, we of course not being in that position because of the use of surplus funds, are in a position where we can soften that significant and sharp increase with the reduction from last year. Ultimately, we did try to craft a budget that both supports our students and made reductions trying to provide a budget that our community can support. And, you know, I think it can't be understated that we recognize that serving our students also means providing their families with the ability to provide them with heat and food, right? So while we will always say we don't have the required supports that we need now in our schools, and we recognize education has been historically underfunded, and the needs have significantly increased, I'd say, since the pandemic overall, but we do feel this budget is in support of all students and attends to those goals of cost containment as well.
Well, why don't we start with how you build the budget? I mean, the preliminary slides
Sure.
kind of bring us through the thinking a little bit more detailed.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we looked at AOE, Agency of Education requirements. We are one of 3 school districts who has been tagged for requiring designated equity supports due to the district's failure to close equity gaps that have been persistent over time.
What's an equity gap?
Equity gaps are significant differences in outcomes, both social, emotionally, and academically, in a variety of assessments. So that could include reporting out on social emotional data in survey form. Most often the Agency of Education will look at things like standardized test scores and say, historically marginalized subgroups are not meeting the same levels of growth or of proficiency rates as their peers, right? And so if those patterns persist over time, there's a need for intervention because there's something occurring which is preventing that growth from occurring.
And are these marginalized subgroups ethnic groups? Are they socioeconomic groups? Are they neurodivergent groups? Is that how you would describe them?
I think so. It depends on the indicators. At our middle school, Frederick H. Tuttle Middle School, where we are required to implement designated equity supports, students who are eligible for individualized education plans is certainly one of the groups. Students of the global majority and students who are eligible for free or reduced lunch are the 3 areas where we need to improve outcomes for those subgroups.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, happy to. So the, as we make reductions, we really want to hear community feedback, and we've gotten a lot of that. Our administrators have been wonderful in providing inputs. I mean, these are the experts in their buildings. Ultimately, we have to take that feedback and synthesize it with the requirements that we're discussing here, from Agency of Education requirements to federal requirements. And within these parameters, we come out with a budget that we believe supports students and reduces the tax burden to something that we hope our community can support. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Jarvis, our Senior Director of Finance, to talk a little bit about some of the factors that are often not brought up in public engagement, right? When we have community forums or board meetings, folks come in to share needs that are directly tied to their students. Big driving factors of cost in our district are factors like health insurance. We've gotten a lot of feedback from community members as we've engaged in budget development process and information sharing after the board has approved the budget, that many in our communities are not aware that healthcare is a cost that is negotiated at a statewide level and it's outside of the district's control. So Tim is going to share the financial impacts of this, which are significant and contribute to the overall 75% of the budget being on these staffing costs.
And that's typical of every organization or business
Very standard.
Operating right now. And every company and business and nonprofit is dealing with the double-digit increases in healthcare. So to take up the issue of education without taking up the issue of healthcare costs is kind of missing half the big story that we're dealing with, right, Tim?
That's correct. So we just want to show some statistics. I don't need to go through this entire slide, but a lot of people just don't realize how much the district needs to spend on employee health care. And for the first time, actually, we've published these statistics. In the past, we would say it's rising, it's high, it's out of our control, but like, what is it? So I just want to share these figures. And this is the district cost. So for a family, a plan, as an example, for the educators, we have a different scale because of different unions, but we're paying over $32,000 a year for health care for a family, and over $34,000 a year for the union and non-union staff, which in some cases, for some of our employees, is actually more than their base salary. And again, as Violet said, this is negotiated by the state, this is out of our control. It's a very generous benefit, there's no question about that, but it's an expensive one.
Let's see that slide again, Kevin, just a little bit more detail. So the premium for a single person that the district has to pay is almost $15,000?
That's the full premium.
Yep.
And then we pay a certain percentage. We pay 80% of that for the
I see.
teachers, and we pay 85% of that for union and non-union support staff.
And so does the individual, the faculty or staff person pays the 20%?
The other 20%, right. So
And
we're
then-
covering a large percentage of the total cost.
And do they have out-of-pocket costs on top of that?
There are out-of-pocket costs, typical of, it's for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont, so
Right.
there's typical co-payments and out-of-pocket costs, but the premiums are largely being covered by the district.
Got it. The reason I ask is because the difference in out-of-pocket between a gold plan and a bronze plan is pretty significant for a person who's, even if they're getting healthcare coverage,
Right.
they're going home with their paycheck and having out-of-pocket to cover healthcare expenses for them and their families. And that can be pretty prohibitive as well. So everyone's bearing a percentage of this cost, it sounds like.
Right, and the gold plan is by far the prevalent choice of our employees.
I imagine it would be,
Yeah.
if you had the choice. It's good coverage when you can get it, so thank you for clarifying that. That's quite helpful.
The next slide is talking about one of the state's formula inputs for calculating our property taxes, which is a long-term weighted average daily membership. And this is a new weight that came into effect for fiscal year 25, so for the current school year, where it isn't just a count of how many students are on their seats in the classrooms. There are different weights assigned for different demographic categories, which you can see here. There's weights for early education, pre-K. There's weights depending on what grade they're in. There's weights for free and reduced lunch, which is the economic disadvantage weight, and the English language learner weight. Those are the weights that impact South Burlington. There's other weights relating to population counts in smaller communities around the state that they get extra credit, so to speak, because they're in small towns or small school districts, which we do not qualify for.
So again, if we could see that slide, Kevin, so just to clarify, a weight has to do with how much a student costs? the
Yeah, so
district?
this is a factor that used to be known prior to Act 127 as the per pupil weight. So the education funding formula is now replaced with this long-term weighted average daily membership. And the weights were introduced in this Act 127 legislation to try to increase equity. So students who, so South Burlington is a densely populated area, whereas, so we receive less weights for those than those rural districts, right? So money essentially from South Burlington will go to those in areas that have more students who get additional weights in the categories that some of the categories, we've just put a few here. So multilingual learners, those who are eligible for free or reduced lunch, which is an increasing number within our district. And we certainly are not getting any weights for any rural status. And over time, we wanted to illustrate the difference here between fiscal year 25 and 26, and you can see these impacts on this bottom row here, where the red is indicating that there's a reduced rate moving forward into fiscal year 26. Ultimately, the impact is just over 60 students for South Burlington, which is a pretty significant reduction in money. If you look at the average per pupil cost, for us, it's about $14,500. So this is a number that diminishes the amount of money that we can put towards staffing and programming.
So the state essentially is going to give you 60 less students at $14,000 a pop in terms of the state money that we get to put towards the budget.
That's
In concept, it's a input into the tax calculation, which takes other
Things into
measurements
account.
into consideration. But
not as linear as one would think.
But certainly, by having lost this 60 count, our tax rate would automatically go up just because of the way the calculation works.
So it impacts the tax rate as opposed to the budget directly.
Correct.
Got it.
Yes.
All right.
Speaking of tax rates, Lauren,
Tax
that was an
rates.
excellent segue.
Great.
So this is a chart which shows for South Burlington tracking what's called the Common Level of Appraisal, or CLA. And this is a factor that the state calculates each year based upon the sales of real estate over a trailing 3-year period. Again, a lot of this stuff is really complex, and it's a very detailed report that supports this. But put in more simple terms, the CLA can be thought of as a real estate inflation factor, that when the market values go up in the city, the CLA will go down. And basically what it's saying is, if it was 100%, then market value and the value of properties on the grand list will be identical.
So there's a lag there, is what you're also saying. So in 2022, when property values were the highest, the tax rate didn't go up immediately in that year.
Well, that's the bars are the CLA. So we basically did a reappraisal for the
Okay.
last time
Oh, I see.
in
All
fiscal
right.
year 22, and by 23, everything kind of evened itself out. So
see.
fiscal year 23 shows that market values and the assessment on the grand list were in line. What's happened since then, and you can see that by the decreasing size of the bars, the CLA has sharply gone down, which means that the market value of homes have gone down, and consequently, the property taxes have gone up.
We sustained 2 years of nearly 10-point reductions in the CLA, and we prepared preliminary budget modeling to show the same this year, so that we were at 74.45 was welcomed, as we'd anticipated another 10-point dip being closer to 72. The CLA is calculated on a 3-year rolling average, and the further we are from reappraisal, and some of you have heard the news that South Burlington is the most expensive place to buy real estate in the state, the further we are from this reappraisal, the more of a difference we're going to see, this delta between the appraised values and what homes are actually selling for. So we would, of course, on the school side, advocate for reappraisal. There is a shortage of appraisers, and so statewide in many areas there are towns or cities who have not been reappraised in a decade or more, which isn't necessarily causing dramatic impact on school budgets in those communities. In South Burlington, where there's been rapid development and there is still a pretty significant housing shortage, it's causing a dramatic impact on our budget.
Well, I would imagine because there's so many units that haven't been included in the grand list. Would that be right?
There's a lot of housing projects that are underway now or that are planned, but in the meantime, there's a housing crisis and certainly an affordability crisis. So while in many of these planned developments, some of them, there are affordable housing options, however, the costs of, with the shortage, home prices are selling at higher and higher rates, and it's becoming more difficult for many of our residents to buy property in South Burlington. And then, of course, that gets translated to renters as well.
So I know that your meetings are covered on a regular basis, and I know that we have 10 minutes left to discuss this. But I would just say it would be great for you to come in regularly to talk about some of these issues, because there's a lot to, as my daughter would say, unpack.
There sure is. I'll share a few highlights here. This graphic I think is helpful for folks. We had talked about that 75% being staff costs associated with salaries and benefits. We're a people business. We support students, and we do so with adults, right? So our money is where our priorities are. You see that here. I won't go into the other expenses at this time. Happy to address any Q&A on that. We, this year, are really proud to be supporting a huge equity issue for us has been transportation. So we're able to add some bus drivers, which feels very supportive for a lot of families. We know that the students who have been mostly impacted by our bus driver shortage, which I'm grateful that the board has rectified due to a side letter, which is increased pay to attract and retain bus drivers. So if students can't come to school, if they're not in the building, they can't learn, right? And some parents and guardians have the ability to take time off or drive their children, and others don't. So we feel really proud to be adding 2 bus drivers. We're maintaining nursing supports, arts, music programming. Some of our neighbors are not in that situation, particularly those who've been impacted in similar ways as us with the ed funding formulas. We're maintaining our pre-K programming and our enrollment there, adding a lot of special education supports. We've seen a sharp increase of students who require individualized education plans, and supporting them is critical. And we are having to, make reductions. We've making athletics reductions and some other programming, which is of course all supportive of students.
So, for example, what would a reduction in athletic offerings be?
So in our current budget, we have reductions of JV B basketball and baseball. I guess our B team. We're working on fall cheer is another one, and we are trying to continue to offer programming in creative ways. So one example is that our athletics director is working with Burlington's on some kind of co-op for cheer, as we've done with Seawolves football, which is a collaborative team made up of Burlington, South Burlington, and Winooski students. The rec department in South Burlington used to facilitate some of these JVB sports, so we're in conversation around how that can happen again. But the reality is, with our third straight fiscal year of reductions in staffing, our ability to continue to offer robust programming and the same is diminished, and we're no longer going to be able to do that in fiscal year 26. So, while we're going to work with our community organizations and look for supports, the reality is, too, there are many supports in the community that are disappearing, right? From alternative programs to mental health supports. Schools are always open tomorrow. We don't have the ability to say, nope, we can't do mental health today, right? So we are looking at some changes. And this slide articulates this nicely, I think. So you see the reductions in staff, and I'll bring you to our, I don't think I included that enrollment slide, did we?
No.
We might have taken that out. So we're seeing some enrollment increases along with staffing reductions.
So can you just go back to that
Sure.
slide that describes the changes, the reductions?
Sure.
eliminates the last one, instructional supports at elementary and middle level, and instructional coaching and IT educator.
Yeah. So last year, so for the fiscal year 25 budget, we eliminated instructional coaching at the high school and middle school level. For the fiscal year 26 budget, we're proposing the elimination of elementary instructional coaches. These are positions who support the effective implementation of curriculum, the use of data to modify instruction to be responsive to student progress, which is important. Instructional coaches help support and implement our multi-tiered systems of supports, and that looks like really effective universal instruction, which is what we call layer one, and then maybe targeted supports, which are in addition to the classroom, right? Like we could say you go to the dentist, that's your universal, and maybe you get a filling, and that could be thought of as a targeted support, but it doesn't mean that you still don't get the annual cleanings, right? So these are ways in which we deliver intentional instruction and track data to ensure student progress in alignment with Common Core state standards and our district stated curricula.
So you're
instructional
eliminating
leadership.
those people.
We are. This is something that, and I'm a former mathematics instructional coach, so I can speak to this with a fair amount of perspective on, the iteration of instructional coaching coming into place in Vermont and now shrinking based on funding changes. We know that we need to prioritize student-facing positions, and so in this budget we've prioritized, we've implemented a structured literacy curriculum, and with that, literacy interventionists to support that. So, delivering that instruction.
That would be such an interesting program to talk about, especially in light of the fact that you're trying to create equity among marginalized subgroups. That role would seem to be an important one in identifying people's needs. So given that we are almost out of time, let's go to the punchline for the voters.
Absolutely. So this one is for Tim Warren, our board clerk.
Sure. I think you want to change it to the homestead to the right.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. So what the board has approved is a budget of upwards of about $71.5 million. That's our fiscal year 26 budget, and that includes a lot of the changes that Superintendent Nichols talked about. That results in proposed income tax, or not income, I apologize, a homestead tax rate increase of about 7.93%, and about $14,400 in per pupil ed spending, and that number 15.58% increase over fiscal year 25. And that's an important number because ballot language has changed, and that 15.58% will show on the ballot going forward now. One caveat here I want to clarify is in relation, I know we were very short on time, is in relation to that surplus that we used last year, and that to some extent skews the numbers this year because had we not used that surplus, we would have had to borrow more from the education fund. Our tax rate increase last year would have been 13 or 14% instead of the 8. So because we suppressed the tax rate sort of artificially with that surplus and borrowed less from the ed fund, which was to the benefit of everybody, it now looks like our spending increase and such percentage-wise has increased greatly.
And how much is that going to cost me as a taxpayer in South Burlington?
Well, let me tell you.
There is a slide for that.
It is going to cost the average condo owner about $29 more per month, and the average home owner about $42 more per month than this year.
Got it. So you want people to support the budget, I imagine. That's why you're here.
Absolutely.
And if they have any questions, how should they get those answered?
Call, email, send a carrier, pigeon carrier, blimps.
And will there be any public meetings to go over the budget?
Absolutely. We have our regular board meetings, and then at that point we'll discuss during our board meetings to make sure that if we do entertain additional meetings, I believe we have a donuts and discussion meeting tomorrow where it'll probably be discussed. That's another forum for people to engage with us. So absolutely, but emails to the board directly are always welcome.
Thank you.
And that would be schoolboard@sbschools.net.
Great, we'll make sure we put that up. Thank you so much for joining us and for all the hard work that you do on behalf of the people and students at South Burlington. Just want to invite people to remember to vote on the 4th of March, 2025. Stay tuned for continuing coverage here at Town Meeting Television. Thanks for watching.